Greetings. This lecture will be on the topic of jnana yoga. And of course, we already read an article on jnana yoga. And as you notice, there's a lot of elements to this path of this yoga of wisdom or yoga of knowledge. Um, and so, what I would like to do is to give you some reference point, maybe an overall view of a particular practice that can give you some kind of anchoring to understand the nature of jnana and jnana yoga. Okay, and as you know, jnana yoga is one of three yogas in the Bhagavad Gita. There's uh, karma yoga, the yoga of action, and bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion to a god or a goddess. And it's kind of interesting. We may not be able to get in today. We'll see. But at some point, all of these three converge. I mean, as uh, Krishna tells Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, at the height of jnana yoga is also the height of karma yoga. Okay, so there's some sort of meeting point where all three become actually very important, different aspects of the one path. But that's for a later lecture. So let's talk about a particular practice called Asparsha Yoga. And Asparsha Yoga is very interesting. I mean, if you remember in Discourse 2, uh, when Arjuna was, so I'm sorry, Krishna was talking about the yoga, and he talks about it's like a turtle. He uses that metaphor of the turtle, that the turtle withdraws its head and its limbs into a shell. And that's kind of uh, an idea or a paradigm of what this yoga is all about, how we basically withdraw our senses and calm down the mind, and we sort of decouple from the world that we're involved in. Okay. And of course, as we discussed earlier in the early Hinduism and the Upanishads, there were a lot of ascetics who left the world. So, Asparsha yoga can mean that, but there's a more subtle way of understanding something like inner renunciation rather than simple external renunciation. We'll get into that in a bit, but let's talk about some terms first. Asparsha. Asparsha comes from sparsha, okay? And sparsha means any kind of contact, like touching, involvement. It includes the perceiving of physical objects, like if I see the blue color of this cup, that's an example of contact, sparsha. If I'm drinking some coffee now, and so if I smell the hazelnut, that's another example of sparsha. And when I, of course, when I go and I grab my coffee cup, that's another example of sparsha. Okay, but sparsha contact can also mean contact with non-physical phenomena. So if I close my eyes and I watch my thoughts, there is a connection between my mind and concepts I'm having. If I'm feeling tired or if I'm feeling excited, those feelings, the fact that I'm experiencing them means that there is sparsha or contact happening. Okay. So basically, if you look at the larger context of what sparsha means, even though the word itself means some sort of sense contact, it's really about our involvement in the world, how we're living in the world. Okay. And that is problematic being involved in the world in this sense. When there is no awakening or liberation, we are pulled out of ourselves, okay? And that's why this turtle metaphor is used. What we need to do is withdraw our senses and mind inwardly so we can begin to see what is the truth about ourselves, okay? So usually involvement with objects includes grasping, avoiding wrong views about objects. And what that means is that as we are living in the world, there's some events, people, experiences that are very pleasant. And so we're kind of drawn to that. Then, of course, we have experiences, or maybe there's some external conditions that are not so pleasant or even painful, and we avoid that. So, already in our involvement in the world, there's this reaction of grasping or attachment and avoiding or resistance. Okay. And we also have wrong views, not just about the objects, but as I said, when we're in contact with the objects, we are in contact with the world. So we have perhaps misperceptions or misconceptions about the nature of the world itself. For instance, because we may have had some pleasant experiences, we may think that somehow there's something in the world that will always be satisfactory for us, that will always give us happiness. Okay, that's one view. That maybe we seek something that's unchanging in the world, or maybe we will seek some deep satisfaction from the external world. All right. And so these are examples of wrong views we can have about as we live our life and as we experience the world. This is how wrong views are influencing our experience. Okay. So perceiving and involvement with objects constitutes the entirety of our living in the world, as I said before. Okay. So this is so when we talk about sparsha, it's a lot more than simply sense contact, okay, or mental contact. All right. So, why Asparsha yoga? And first, the term is the negative prefix, so it means non contact, non involvement, and non identification. Okay. And this is where it becomes important when we're talking about the metaphor of the turtle withdrawing itself. Is it real physical withdrawal or is there something deeper? All right. So, one, non identification with perceived objects. Okay, that's one way of understanding a sparsha. Okay, non-involvement with objects, that is, no grasping, no avoiding, and the abandoning of wrong views. And three, the non-identification and non-involvement constitute the inner renunciation of our living in the world. Okay, and so a sparsha, when you're talking about non-contact, isn't simply um, detaching ourselves. Okay, what's going on underneath is that somehow, as we are involved in the world, we identify with things. We identify with our body, for instance. That's a big thing. Okay, for instance, if you have a cold, you say, "Oh, I'm sick." Well, you know, yeah, that could be true, but in that sentence signifies or implies that you are identify that you are your body, okay? Or if, for instance, you get annoyed at something and then you reflect and you say, "Oh, I'm always angry at people." Again, now you are identifying with the mental state, okay? If you identify with the opinions you have, in whatever realm, you are misidentifying yourself as those opinions. And so, what we're doing is when we have experiences of so called external phenomena, which include the physical world, our social, cultural experiences, and even our emotional experiences and the thoughts that we have, we are sort of projecting ourselves out onto that and as if we are those phenomena. Okay. And as you recall, when we talked about before, that what's really going on is that uh, we have our subjective awareness that's there. Our ability to experience anything presupposes some kind of awareness, some sort of openness, some sort of perceptual sphere. And Asparsha Yoga, as non contact, really signifies an internal renunciation, that is, a decoupling from our identification with um, the external world, our thoughts, our feelings, our concepts, our ideas, and to move backwards to, as somebody said, that is a nice phrase, retracing the radiance, to go backwards and retrace the subjective awareness that allows us to experience things. Okay. So if we really look at it, prior to any specific experience, there needs to be awareness, right? And we've talked about this before a little bit in class. And if that's the case, that maybe who we really are is that awareness and not the specific phenomena that we are experiencing. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the practice and then we'll come back to the philosophy near the end. So there are some preliminaries in terms of how somebody will begin this practice. And let me just say, usually people come to a practice like yoga. Um, I'm teaching a course on Zen, and I also talked about this too, that people who join Zen monasteries usually do so because of some deep human suffering they've experienced. Okay. to actually begin to uh, embark on a spiritual practice, spiritual exercises that can be difficult because it demands discipline and it demands attention and energy. Something has to motivate you, okay? And it's usually the sense of either meaninglessness or some sort of human suffering that really compels us to maybe search for another way of being in the world. Because the current way that we are in the world can be producing a lot of anxiety, anger, suffering, etc. Okay. So the first thing is, so there's human suffering, and then we begin contemplating the world itself to actually step back and look at how we are in the world and how we're living in the world can maybe be creating this suffering. And so, what is the true nature of the world? Well, if we recall Nachiketas and Yama, the dialogue between Nachiketas and Yama, Yama, of course, first gives him these gifts. He wants to offer gifts of gold, cows, many children, happiness in the external world. And of course, Nachiketas refused. And basically, he is somebody who has already contemplated that whatever a satisfaction you find in the world, whatever power, whatever pleasantness that you find in the world, even though you can find those in the world, uh, they don't last. The nature of the world is change, and the powerful fall, the rich become poor, and of course, we're also subject to suffering too. As human beings, we are as embodied beings, we are subject to aging, disease, and death. Okay, and so that's why Nachiketus wants to go beyond the world, understanding that simply living a worldly life is in itself suffering. Okay, so then why practice yoga? Well, because like any religious or spiritual discipline, yoga has some vision of what is possible. Okay. And first of all, what's also, well, let me just back up a little bit. It's also interesting, like if you remember reading the Kena Upanishads, they're not asking, what is seen, but that whereby, you can see, like what is that subjective awareness? There's already a hint that that there's something more, I can put this, authentic in you, something that's more deeply subjective, right? That awareness, all right? And so the promise is that through yoga, you'll begin to understand what that inner subjectivity is. And in the end, it's going to be Atman. And once you realize Atman, you can transcend the world of suffering, okay? And of course, in that promise is that we can attain true freedom or spiritual peace by yoga practice. All right. So, like many disciplines, in the beginning of the path, there's some considerations that needs to be met. And again, this is repeating what some of the ideas in the previous slide, that you have to realize the true nature of the world and how we're living in the world according to this paradigm. And so that what does the world do? It provides temporary pleasures and comforts, but also brings pain, and all of it is temporary. And as I said before, in the end, we as embodied beings are subject to aging, disease, and death. Okay, so there is a certain deep unsatisfactoriness to living and existing just as a worldly being. So the path of yoga is now a vision of possibility to overcome the world. Now, when we say world, we're not talking about the objective natural world or the cosmos. World in this sense is our being in the world, that we have to break out of this sort of individualist view that somehow we're just sort of atomistic beings and we're just sort of living in this space. As we talked about, when we live in an academic world and you walk into the room, you see a room of tables and whiteboards and projectors, and you expect the professor to come in, and that's a world. That's an academic, intellectual world, right? But using the same example we did in class before, but if you're an engineer and you have to fix the heating problem in that room, you could be in the exact same objective room, but it's a different room. right? You're looking at the outlets. You're trying to find out what is it that's causing, for instance, the failure of the heating system to heat this particular room. And so, even though you could be walking into the same room, you see an entirely different thing. So that's the world of engineering, the world of fixing these problems. Okay, so that's what the world really means. So when the path of yoga is okay, the path of yoga is now a vision of possibility to overcome the world. A Then what you need to do is commit to the path. Okay, so there needs to be a commitment to follow the path after serious contemplation of our worldly life, to seeing the limits and the transiency of our worldly existence. Okay. What's also important, though, is something called cognitive formation. And a lot of times people think that meditation or yoga is you just practice yoga and you feel better and you calm down, and that's all good. But you need more according to this yogic path. You need to have a reorientation of your perspective. Okay, and that includes what like contemplating the world and its true nature and all that. But stepping back and generally talking about this, cognitive formation is very important. That's why, for instance, it's important to if you're going to follow a teacher or a guru, to follow one that has actually walked the path and has realized Atman. Okay, it's important also to, for instance, study the Upanishads and to perhaps study the commentaries of the Upanishads to get some sort of philosophical, even metaphysical reorientation of how you begin seeing the world. You know, otherwise you'll just practice some mindfulness here and get some peace there, but it's never going to really bring you to a transcendental experience, if you will. Okay. So this new cognitive framework, is both a reference point, like a map, and it's also a vehicle for our practice. And this sense of vehicle comes from um, actually an early Buddhist simile. Now, when I'm talking about Advaita Vedanta, we're talking about a school that arose after the Upanishadic text arose, after Buddhism and other religious traditions arose. So, and they also use this idea of raft, and basically this is the simile. So you begin contemplating the world, and you recognize, metaphorically speaking, you're on the shore of suffering. You're living your worldly life. It's no longer satisfactory. There may be the crisis of meaning, whatever suffering is arising for you. And through your exposure to, for instance, a yogic philosophy, you begin to see, well, there's a different shore. There's another shore that is one of peace and freedom and authenticity. And in between is this river. Okay. And so what you need to do is, when you're on the shore of the worldly existence, is to begin building a raft. And that's a metaphor for listening to a teacher, to engaging in dialogue, to studying the text. And this is like building a raft, a spiritual raft for you, so you can cross the river. That can be, sometimes they describe this as a raging river, but you need a very strong raft to go across from the shore of suffering to the shore of liberation. Now, this is just a metaphor. There is this notion of unity, oneness, and monism. So don't take this too far. But that's basically how teachings are seen, as something useful. So teachings are not necessarily metaphysical systems that reflect some reality. It's not like a how can I put this? It's not like a proposition in the context of Western philosophy, whether a proposition is true or not. Part of the truth of any yogic system is how effective it is to bring you to that shore of peace and freedom. Okay, so there's a pragmatic, spiritually pragmatic content in that. Okay, all right. So the practice itself, and this is going to be sort of a summarizing, but in a more structured way. So when you begin practicing a Sparsha Yoga, it begins with a calm observation, and that's why you know doing meditation is also important. Having a deep philosophical understanding is important too, but there also has to be a calmness because when you begin framing the way you see the world and observing the world, there has to be a non-reactivity. Okay, so you begin with a calm observation of the world or our worldly involvement, and then we have an inner renunciation of the world we live in. We begin to recognize that indeed, as we are watching, like our thoughts arise, as we are watching our reactions to the world, whether we're grasping or avoiding, when we project ideas out there, we begin to see that that's really not us. Because if awareness needs to be there prior to any particular experience or contact with the world, then the awareness itself becomes more prominent. And as you begin to see that, you begin to let go of your identification with the external phenomena in our, being in the world and living in the world. Okay. And once you've done that, you begin realizing, well, maybe my true self is this awareness. And so now practice becomes a cultivation of our identification with what the Vedantists call the sakshin, the witness consciousness, that mode of being which is non-reactive awareness of anything we're experiencing. Okay, and the more we do that, the more we come into contact with who we really are. All right, it's a non-reactive awareness. So we're not pulling away from the world. We're not looking at the different experiences and the conditions and trying to close our eyes and run away from that. We're not negating anything. But what we're doing is seeing it non-reactively. Okay. And then, of course, practice also includes quote unquote practical elements. For instance, uh, developing compassion and kindness toward others. Now, again, of course, the highest vision would be, we're all one or something like that, and which we'll get to a little bit later. Um, well, not in this lecture, but later in class. But we're not there yet, okay? So as we are meditating, as we are stepping back and not identifying with the external phenomena anymore, as we are identifying ourselves with that non-reactive awareness, the sakshin or witness consciousness, there also has to be practical aspects. For instance, having a compassionate and kind disposition toward others, okay? We need to develop concentration, some level of mental stability to actually observe non-reactively, okay, and some disciplined living. It doesn't do you any good to to study philosophy for 2 hours and then do yoga and then go out and party, I guess. All right, and so there needs to be some disciplined living too. So these so-called practical aspects are very important too. All right. Now, when we look at the entire, now there's a lot more to this. This is just an overview, and I hope I'm giving you this overview again. Like I said in the beginning, I'm giving you just to give you a reference point. So as you study, reread the article, for instance, and as we study Jnana Yoga some more in the semester, you'll begin to see how all this works. Okay. So when we're talking about practice and using the raft metaphor, especially, we call practice, generally speaking, sadhana. Sadhana is a Sanskrit term that can mean practice. Sadhana can mean a tool or a device to get you somewhere. Sadhana, the raft is the perfect metaphor for sadhana, that vehicle through which you can attain what you intend to attain. So that's what sadhana is. Um, but at a deeper level, sadhana as practice really especially for those of you who have been practicing meditation, um, meditation is actually following a method of meditation is on the one hand necessary but also contradictory. Okay, and I'll explain that in a second. So what we can say is that sadhana really exists at the intersection of what we could call the horizontal and vertical dimensions of experience. All right. So let's go into the horizontal and vertical, which the author mentioned, Palvaraj Michael mentioned. And I'm going to give my own take on what this horizontal and vertical means. Okay. So the horizontal dimension, that's our everyday life. That's our existence in the world, our being in the world. And if you and it's horizontal because if you look at it, here we are right now in the present moment. And as we're living our life, we are projecting into the future, right? We need to get groceries. That's something maybe immediate. I need to study for an exam, or you're planning registrations coming up in a few weeks, or maybe you want to plan the next 2 years of your the college curriculum so you can graduate on time. Maybe even longer, you want to major in something to get a job in a particular sector, gain some employment, right? So we have all this future. So the horizontal dimension includes our future projections, our hopes, and maybe even our fears. We don't want to go down this road. Also realize that the horizontal dimension also is the past, right? Because in order to see yourself as getting a college degree and getting a job because you have a college degree is you've been told that in the past, and so your past kind of conditions, not again completely, but circumscribes the different future horizon, the future possibilities that you have. Okay, and again, as we said in class, as let's say your more immediate goals are met, they become your past, right? And it gives you, like, so you gain experience. So maybe last summer you worked as an intern somewhere. Well, that's was maybe a future goal before, but once you've done that, now you have this experience, so you're more informed about the world, and that's going to affect how you see the future. And so what's happening is, as we live in the present, the horizontal dimension is the stretch of temporality between past and future and their interaction. Okay, so it's dynamic. It's not a simple linear dot by dot progression, right? Past and future intermingle to condition how we see our present moment, right? But our present moment is still seen in terms of our future possibilities based on our past experiences. Okay, so that's the horizontal dimension. All right. And in yogic philosophy and other kinds of spiritual disciplines, which includes, let's say, Christian mysticism and other forms of, so this really occurs in many, many traditions. To understand the horizontal dimension is to understand what the world is all about. Okay. And so in these so-called spiritual traditions, which is you take a step back and you actually look at this horizontal dimension, well, what's at the end? No matter how successful you are, I mean, going back to Nachiketa's, you can't take that success when you die. And death will come, just as aging and disease will. Okay? And so if you live purely in the horizontal dimension, you're mortal, you're finite, things change. There's a lot of uncertainty because you can have all these plans, and as we know, plans don't always work out. Okay? And so when we understand a horizontal dimension in that way, this is where, for instance, yogic philosophical traditions kick in and say, well, there is a different dimension to life, that there is actually a different perspective you can take on life that gives you a whole sense of existence in a different way. All right. And that's what the vertical dimension is. The vertical, and it's vertical, really is not about a transient present moment being pulled between past and future. Okay, the vertical dimension is a grounding in, we could call it the present moment, I guess. um, Let me use a very old metaphor used by some Hindu schools and certainly by Buddhism to make sense of this vertical dimension. Okay, there's something in, for instance, Tibetan Buddhism. They do this meditation, Big Sky Mind. It actually comes from the Indian tradition. It's called Akasha, space or sky. Mandala. Mandala is something you meditate on, a figure, and all that. And so just imagine yourself. So you're sitting on the grass and you're looking at the sky. Okay. And it's a clear day, it's sunny, blue sky, and there are a few clouds, passing by. Okay. Very slowly, it's very peaceful, right? And let's just say all of a sudden you feel kind of a cold wind blowing, and all of a sudden things get a little darker, the clouds become gray, and you realize, oh, a storm is coming. Okay. And so you know, depending on your disposition, maybe you enjoy, these sunny days and these clouds just gently floating, or maybe you like storms, and all that. But in any case, whatever it is, maybe you're attracted to one and you want to avoid the other. Okay, and so uh, the the important point here is that no matter what the clouds are doing, right? Whatever even the weather is, the sky doesn't change. It is simply the openness. Okay, if that makes sense, all right. And so when we're living in the horizontal dimension, we are pulled out of ourselves and we want those nice, fluffy clouds that are moving peacefully. And we want to avoid the stormy clouds, let's just say. Okay. And so we're constantly reacting to the world. And the fact is that sometimes the weather is, very peaceful, and sometimes it's not. It can be very violent. Okay. But the nature of the sky doesn't change. It's just openness, right? And so the vertical dimension could be something like this, that rather than focusing on the gentle clouds that you want and the stormy clouds that you don't want, and rather than reacting to the phenomena of weather, all right, if you step back and realize that no matter what the weather is, the sky is the sky, that is something like the vertical dimension. It's a touch point where you no longer are pulled into the changing nature of relative worldly existence to the absolute, if you will, the absolute openness that allows for clouds to arise, right? The sky allows for, you know, these white clouds or gray clouds to arise, the weather to change, okay? And that's the vertical dimension. Now, I said that sadhana is sort of not contra. I use the word contradictory. It's not contradictory, but it's paradoxical, because when you engage in a practice, once you've reflected on the world, and let's say now you want to move on and have that greater vision, you have to practice. But practice at some level is still in a worldly context. Okay, that's why in this last point I say sadhana. It's the crossing point of the horizontal and the vertical. Okay. And what is happening is that every time you engage in sadhana, um, um, you begin stripping layers of your consciousness. You have these surface level thoughts, and you have deeper thoughts and feelings, um, and again, as some people who have done a lot of hardcore meditating, they said it's not always peaceful. Sometimes it's like opening Pandora's box. Okay, so what is happening is you start dealing with the horizontal at the not the most, but in a sort of a surface level, right? Of course, things change, and we're finite, we're going to age, and we can't take our wealth. That's all true, but that's sort of the beginning, okay? But as we go deeper, sadhana, how can I put this? It discloses deeper dimensions of um, our attachments to the world, right? And it's not simply that we experience some good things and bad things, but a lot of times the reactivity that happens comes from, let's say, internal trauma. Maybe something happened when you were a child, okay? And it's not just personal trauma; it could be, communal trauma too. And so, sadhana is slowly undoing um, these like defense mechanisms and these reactions, and we began to see that a lot of times our disposition to how we see the world is really based on what I mentioned before, samskaras, right? The deep memory traces we have in our subconscious, and those samskaras, as I said before, are almost like living entities, right? Memories are not just pictures; they're just like a little data point, right? That's why one word, for instance, that can trigger a memory, you could, in a flash, live a past trauma, for instance. Okay, and so sadhana is at the crossing point. And that's important because you don't simply move from, clouds to sky, right? You don't simply just realize, oh, I am the awareness of the phenomena, not the phenomena itself, because given our embodied maybe even biological wiring, there is this need of, there is this, how can I put this, a subconscious grasping onto the world. All right. And it gets subtler and subtler. And that's what sadhana is. That's why it's at the crossing point of the horizontal and the vertical. Because the horizontal, even though when I used my gesture, the fleeting present stretched between the past and the future, it's not just like this. There's also a depth to it. The being stretched is really motivated by deeper samskaras that are sort of living in our subconscious and ready to uh, you know uh, bloom, if you will, using that flower metaphor. And when the conditions are right and samskaras happen, well, that's usually when suffering happens. Okay. Um, when I say suffering, I'm going to end pretty soon, but let me just give you another metaphor. It's called the two darts metaphor. Okay. And so suffering happens in two ways. Okay. There is certainly physical suffering, like when you stub your toe or you get sick. Okay. But the most important thing is the mental suffering. All right, within these traditions. And whether you look at Buddhism or Hinduism or other spiritual traditions, because when we think about it, a lot of our suffering doesn't necessarily come from a particular concrete event. Okay, you stub your toe, that's a concrete event, and maybe you get a little bit annoyed, and maybe you cracked your toe and you have to go to the doctor and all that. That's fine. But if you think about it, when we have these experiences, we build narratives around these experiences. And that's the other aspect of the world, the personal narratives we have about who I am, what the world is like. Um, you know, when I experience something, I experience it through a filter. And now the filter can be more, I guess, healthy or more beneficial. I'll say beneficial, especially if you've practiced some. Or the filters can be very destructive. You can just, and we've all done this. Something sparks a thought, and then the thought builds on other thoughts, and we can go to a negative downward spiral. And sadhana is about seeing all of that. Okay, so not just the horizontal in terms of its linear plane, but the deeper subconscious samskaras. Okay, and once we do that, once we begin to see the samskaras, begin to eliminate that, then we're really truly on our way to this deeper sense of liberation. Right? Okay. Well, I hope this was helpful. Um, like I said, I want to bring in more practical aspects because, this philosophy can get very abstract. And it's really not about abstraction. All these philosophies coming from, Hinduism, Buddhism, and other spiritual traditions, they are there as a map, as a way of life, not simply thinking metaphysical thoughts or dealing with logical puzzles. Okay, this is not an intellectual game. This is an actual, let's say, even existential commitment to a way of seeing the world and realizing a different way of being in the world. Okay, all right. So, well, we will see you on Wednesday.